Have you ever had a season in your life? Well, I asked that question. I know you have. I know the answer already before you answer it, and even before I ask the question. But have you ever had a season in your life where you felt like the bad thing that's going on right now will never end? I got to be honest, there's one area of our life my wife and I are going through right now that we want it to end so badly. It's so painful to watch and difficult to endure, and seeing people that we love and care for just being mistreated and living with broken hearts and disappointment and sadness. It's just very, very painful. And I just tell you that last week it looked like we were just getting it. The thing was going to finally come to a close, and it got delayed yet another week. And so we still have to look forward to even more of the same, it appears. But one of the things that Peter went on to say to these believers that he's writing to, that they certainly were feeling this as they began to feel the squeeze of persecution and pressure, and began to see hardships and sufferings come into the lives of people they loved, and also maybe even to their own lives. And they just said, would this ever end, God? How long, O Lord? How long? As the psalmist repeated so many times. And Peter's answer is in verse 7. He says, the end of all things is near. The end of all things is near. And I know some of you are going, well, Jesus still hasn't come back, and that's almost 2,000 years ago he said that. All right. But in many ways, the end of all things is very near, because if nothing else, life is pretty short. I mean, it's hard to believe that. If you're under 25, you may not believe that life is short. If you're over 45, you probably have some sense of that. But when you get to a place where I'm at, where you're almost 75, believe me, you look back and go, that was quick. I mean, life is just a vapor that appears for a moment and passes away. And we always say that, if I'd known how long I was going to live, that was George Burns' line. If I'd known how long I was going to live, I would have taken better care of myself. And that's somewhat true. I don't have a great deal of regrets, but I probably wouldn't have drank as many Diet Cokes as I did in my 30s. But the whole thing is that you realize that the end is very near. It's near for everybody. And I hope on one hand that the end is going to come because Christ is going to rapture this church from off the earth. I mean, we're living in a time where that seems more plausible all the time. But it may not be the case. I may end my earthly journey long before that day comes. So what he says is that we need to live our lives with that sense of terminality. As one of our friends in our church, came to me recently, and he had been diagnosed with a really severe case of cancer. And he said, well, the doctor said it's terminal. And something I share with people when they tell me that is that, well, to be honest, we all are. Some of us are more terminal than we realize. Some of us have been told by a doctor we're terminal. Now, the interesting thing in his case is it seems like he's improving dramatically right now. We're very, very hopeful. So he may not be as terminal as the doctors thought he was. Basically, they're kind of dropping their jaw and can't figure out what's happening. You and I know what's happening. But nonetheless, whether we live to be 100 or we live to be 10, we're all going to find that the space of time we live is very short. And part of the thing that's fascinating to me is trying to conceptualize eternity where time doesn't exist. And I have this view that eternity is all around us. We just can't experience because we're held in the bondage of time. We think that time is this precious gift, but the only good thing I know about time is what enables me to change my mind. Time is what enables me to say, I'm sorry. Time is what enables me to repent and say, forgive me for what I did in a previous time, and don't hold that against me in future time. That's what time is to me now. It's become this thing that I marshal through, and it's this place where I'm able to grow and to change and mature and hopefully become more Christ-like before time completely runs out. But in many ways, the reality is that when I leave time and I go into eternity, I really think that my mom and dad, and my grandparents and aunts and uncles and other people who I know knew Christ and are in heaven right now, I think that before they even were able to turn around and figure out what happened to them, they found themselves looking at me, because there is no time. so that this thing called time just no longer is a factor. It's no longer a dimension of our reality. So that old song, wonderful song, Amazing Grace says, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. That's a very human way of looking at eternity. 10,000 years seems like an endless amount of time. Boy, I sure hate to live that long. But the whole point is, I mean, time has no ability to be able to relate to eternity. And that's the thing, that when we're born again and Christ lives on us, that's part of what he gives us. He says in Ecclesiastes, he says, God has put eternity in our heart. In other words, our ability to know that there is this eternal dwelling place that we can be with God is something that God gave to us. He placed it inside of us. We didn't conceptualize it. We didn't think it up. He wrote it into the DNA of who we are so that we know that we weren't created for time, that we were created for eternity. And it's sad when I see people, I mean, we hear a lot of times about, great public figures who talk about their legacy and they're working to establish their legacy. When they become rich, they become famous, they've done everything, they have no accolades that they haven't acquired, and now they're looking at death and they realize they don't take anything with them, but they worry about their legacy. Well, in our city center, we have a wonderful statue of Abraham Lincoln next to the federal building. What's amazing to me is I don't think Abraham Lincoln ever saw that statue. In fact, I know he didn't, and I don't ever think he thinks about it in eternity. And yet those things we put there for ourselves to give us this idea that somehow, like many Reformed Jewish believers, we live on in the memories of our loved ones, and so those who have gone before or still remain behind. And they say things like that. May those who survive you have wonderful memories and thoughts of you. My goodness gracious, what good does that do me? No, I don't lose my consciousness at death. My consciousness is part of my soul, and I carry that with me into eternity because my soul and my consciousness are spirit. They're not matter. But I shed the matter. I leave it behind. And that's why, we find that Peter begins to really pour, and he says, because life is so short, whether Christ comes in our lifetime or we pass away, eternity for every one of us is always right around the corner. And that's why he said, therefore, in light of that, if you will, be alert. Sophoneo, the Greek word here is really interesting. It's being right-minded, being self-controlled, being moderate. Literally, it's been translated as curb your passions. In other words, he's talking about don't be a person who is led by your human appetites, being sensually driven. And that's where people live who are without Christ. That's who Peter was talking about previously. They live sensually. Their human appetites are what drives them. And I would say not only the appetites of food and other kinds of sensual pleasure, but even pride and accomplishment and possessions and greed. Those are all sensual things. Those are movements or motives that grow out of our sensuality, to have, to grasp, to hold, to experience, to cling, to try to find some kind of safety and security in that stuff. He says, don't let your life be controlled by that. Let your life be controlled by something that is eternal, and that is what's awaiting you on the other side of this world. On the other side of death is eternity. So he says, don't lose sight of that. Be right-minded. Think about these things clearly. In fact, he follows up by saying, be sober-minded. This word sober-minded, it's actually one short word in Greek, nepho. Nepho. It means being free from the influence of intoxicants. Now, we're obviously talking about alcohol and drugs and other substances who alter our judgment, our sense of judgment, which is certainly first and foremost the way the word nepho would have been used. But it also talks about being intoxicated by other things, lust and pleasure and pride and greed and other things that really distort our way of thinking and cause us to be motivated to do things for wrong reasons. I mean, when I encounter people who lie, cheat, and steal, and I'm afraid they populate the planet quite abundantly, I realize that these are people who have lost sight or never have had sight of eternity. And I have to oftentimes step back and go, wait a minute, it's not that long before I'm going to be standing before the presence of my Lord in eternity. How do I want to deal with this? How do I want to deal with what's in front of me? We always get hit with the thing of what would Jesus do or love like Jesus loved, which I'm not saying is wrong. But I think what's more powerfully impactful in our thinking isn't just simply trying to live up to Jesus' standard, but to realize that I'm one day going to be standing before him. And in those areas where I've fallen short, those are going to be washed away and forgiven. But those areas where I was really able to mimic Christ in a real, meaningful way are where my rewards are going to be. What are those rewards? I don't know, but we'll continue to talk about it tomorrow. Thanks for following. Be with you tomorrow.